three of the most insane trades in NBA history, trading away Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett to now create the backbone of the Boston Celtics, which are now the best team in the entire league, trading out of the first overall pick back to third to then go ahead and draft Jason Tatum, as well as trading away Rudy Gobert for what is arguably the most insane package of draft picks and compensation in exchange for a guy in Rudy Gobert that was never a star in the first place. All three of those deals were made by one person, and that person is Danny Ainge. And his resume is so crazy at this point that I don't even understand why NBA teams attempt to trade with him. Just don't call him, hang up the phone. Oh, and I also forgot about when he traded for Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen and immediately won a title with the Celtics, as well as when he traded away basically nothing in exchange for Isaiah Thomas, who became a second team All-NBA caliber player. And then there's like 4 other trades you could add on to that as well, any of which would be the career highlight of like half the active GMs in the league right now. But for Danny Ainge, it's just another trade. And this guy's resume is so ridiculous that, again, I really feel like teams just shouldn't even trade with him. And there's a couple of different reasons that I feel like he's been so good at this over the years. Going back to that first example I gave when they brought in Kevin Garnett and they brought in Ray Allen, that trade to me speaks to a guy in Danny Ainge that knew exactly where his team was at and what they needed. He understood where Paul Pierce was at the time, maybe his frustrations with the franchise, the pieces that they were able to bring in, and to be able to strike on that and not only win a title immediately, but also be a finals contender for the few years following. He's also a fantastic talent evaluator. I don't think people understand how big of a deal it was that he traded out of the first pick and still ended up with Jason Tatum. This is something I've talked about in an entire video before. Looking back on that deal, it was a consensus. Everybody in the league, with the exception of apparently Danny Ainge, would have taken Markelle Fultz first overall in this draft, and he decided to move back to get Jason Tatum because he understood where the league was going, and he was able to evaluate not only his own team, not only that draft itself, but also where the league was going as a whole, and the understanding that having a bigger wing like Tatum that could create and guard was a better asset and a better player to have on your team than someone like Fultz, who was just a guard perimeter creator. There were a ton of those in the league at the time. But to me, the defining characteristic of Danny Ainge as a GM is he's always a little bit ahead of the curve, whether that be the things that I've already talked about in this video or understanding the direction that his roster is going and being willing to change things up and go in a different direction a little bit earlier than other teams are anticipating. You can go back and look at when he traded away Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett to the Nets and got all those draft picks. That team was still decent. They still could have been a pretty decent playoff team, but he understood the value he could get in exchange for those guys. Despite what they meant to the franchise, he was cutthroat about it, he was ruthless about it, and understood, let's do what's best for the future of the franchise above all else. And now that he's in Utah, we're seeing that once again, whether it be the Donovan Mitchell trade, which I think was pretty forward thinking at the time. Mitchell was under a long-term contract. They could have not forced him to stay, but there was no outward trade request. Mitchell probably would have been unhappy playing on this version of the Jazz once they traded away Rudy Gobert and probably wanted to go somewhere where we would have been able to compete at a very high level. But they could have kept Donovan Mitchell, but he understood, hey, this is the peak of this guy's value. I can shop him around to the rest of the league. He's still young. He's under contract for multiple years. So that opens up all kinds of possibilities. I don't just have to trade him to the Knicks or the Lakers, ultimately ends up going to Cleveland. And then of course the Rudy Gobert trade is another aspect of that. He realized that he took over a Utah team that they were fine. You know, they were a pretty solid team, maybe went around, maybe 2, sometimes had the ceiling to do that, but they weren't a championship level team. And not only that, but they didn't have the assets to continue to add and continue to build onto the roster in a way that would make them a championship level team. And so he recognized that, and being able to get that much value out of those two guys in Mitchell and Gobert has completely turned around and set up the Jazz for an incredible future moving forward. It mirrors, honestly, a lot of what he did in Boston and trading away Garnett and Pierce in the first place. And I'm not kidding, by the way. Like, I would just put Danny Ainge's number on like the do not disturb list. Like, I wouldn't answer the phone. I wouldn't bother trading with him because he really doesn't lose trades. All the stories you hear about him in terms of negotiations are he's a very like hard line stance negotiator. Like, he understands the value of his players. He understands the value of other teams' players, and he's going to either get what he wants or he's not going to make the deal. And ultimately, like, I would stay away from this guy. And what's really interesting about him as well is he does a great job of identifying those teams around the league that are really, really desperate. So going back to when he traded Garnett and Pierce to Brooklyn, that was a desperate team. They had an owner that came in that wanted to win. They had a couple of players that were decent, but they really wanted to elevate their chances of possibly winning a championship. And so he was able to get all those picks and all those pick swaps from them because he understood the situation not only that his team was in, but that the other team was in as well. And it's a pretty similar situation with Minnesota in terms of a new front office. They're, you know, at the time there were rumors of a new ownership group coming in. They wanted to make a splash, and he capitalized on that and understood, hey, you guys want Rudy Gobert? He's really good. He's an all-NBA caliber player. He's an all-defense caliber player. You should just give me every single asset that you have that you're willing to trade. And that is an underrated part, I feel like, of talent evaluation and making good trades in the league, is understanding the context of other teams and teams that potentially you could take advantage of in a trade. But you know what's the weirdest part of all this is I've said all these great things about Danny Ainge, how great of a GM he is I wouldn't even bother calling him if I was looking to make a trade. Yet Boston was willing to get rid of him. And I think there's a couple of different reasons for that. One, when you're somewhere for so long, at some point you just want to go in a different direction and you just come to a mutual agreement, ends up in Utah now, alongside a couple of guys that he's really good friends with. And that totally makes sense. But also, like, he didn't do a great job in the draft outside of the Tatum thing. Like, there's a lot of, picks in the teens and late lottery that just didn't work out in Boston. Now, good for them. They had so many first because of the Nets trades. But we're talking about like RJ Hunter, James Young, like a ton of different guys, Yabusele. Like, there's a ton of guys in the teens that it just never worked out in Boston in terms of those kinds of draft picks. And until Tatum recently, and of course Jaylen Brown as well, which I think is a really underrated selection, they never really drafted all-stars. They traded for them, being Kyrie. They traded obviously for Garnett and Ray Allen, and Paul Pierce was already there. But that, I think, was a little bit of a hole in his game, but he's going to have an opportunity to really change that around. And that, to me, is the most interesting part of all this, is what the future now looks like for Utah because Danny Ainge got there. Like, if they didn't bring him in, I'm really curious what their team would look like. Would they still be the Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert, Utah Jazz? Like, we heard for years that there were rumors and rumblings that maybe Mitchell didn't want to play alongside Gobert. He just wanted to be on a different team in general. Maybe they wouldn't have made those moves this past offseason, just like they didn't make those moves in the prior years when we had very similar, kind of rumors coming out about those guys. And it's a really interesting evaluation of how much things can change for you and for your franchise by just getting the right people in place. And I think it's very easy to argue that Danny Ainge is one of the greatest NBA GMs of all time, just based off of, you think about what are some of the best trades, what are some of the greatest returns in the history of the league. His name is attached to like at least two of those, if you're counting the Rudy Gobert trade there already, and then of course the initial, Nets trade. And then there's a ton of other ones as well. And it's not just star trades. Like, it's not just trading away Garnett and Pierce. It's not just trading away Gobert and Mitchell, but it's those other smaller ones as well. Like the Isaiah Thomas one goes so under the radar because that elevated them to a new level and allowed them to transition into this era with Brown and Tatum and ultimately Kyrie and Horford. And obviously, each of those guys left it at different points. But those smaller moves, not just getting the star trades right, but getting that level of value, trading away basically nothing for a guy that ultimately becomes a second team all NBA caliber player. The importance of that for an NBA general manager cannot be overstated. And for Utah moving forward, what I think this is all leading to is something that we've already seen from him. When you think about where Boston was at the time that he brought in Ray Allen and Kevin Garnett, and they ultimately go on to win the title, they had assets. They were stockpiling young players. They had some picks as well, and they had a franchise guy in Paul Pierce that they knew they wanted to build around, but they didn't quite know how to. And I think that's a future that we're potentially leading to here in Utah. Is they're going to have all the picks, they're going to have all the young players, and at some point he's going to see an opportunity to go get a star, go get 2 stars, or try and finesse his way into some all NBA caliber guys, and he's going to have the assets to be able to do that. And it might mirror a very similar situation what we saw in Boston. If he goes from that, like if he goes from winning the title in Boston by bringing those guys in, transitioning into a new era, setting them up for a ton of success, now going to Utah, making 2 fantastic trades, and then leading to possibly title contention there in Utah, I think he would honestly cement himself as the greatest general manager in the history of the league. And it's also just a great example of how difficult it is to do this well, because he might go down as the greatest general manager in the history of the league, and he does have his name attached to all these fantastic trades. And as I said earlier, Boston was kind of done. Like, they were kind of ready to get rid of him. He was ready to go and do other stuff. There was health stuff. There was all kinds of factors to it. But you would imagine that when you have someone like that, you do everything you could to keep him. And that's just not the situation Boston was in, even to the point where they moved their own head coach up to the front office. Now they've got their own head coaching situation figured out. It is one of the more interesting stories in the modern history of the league. I feel like the history and the career of Danny Ainge.